Okay. Um, I promised after the last talk that this would not be a full lecture. I'm not quite sure what it was going to be. Um, it turns out when I wrote up what I thought I had to say, it's a little longer than I hoped it would be, but it's certainly not a full lecture. And I'll try and half read it and half talk it, and then see what we have to talk about. Um, the working title we gave to this last one was Why Hegel? And I guess I've tried to sort of give at least sketches of maybe why Hegel from one point of view or another. Um, One of the things I didn't do was take up the thing I said right at the beginning about my claim that the art that I was talking about could be in some sense said to read Hegel, and that, at the end, it's going to be up to you to decide whether I had lived up to that or was it merely a metaphor or whatever. In any case, I've got nothing more to say about that. It is whatever it is. But it seemed to me it was worth trying to separate out maybe a little bit, at least some of what I think is maybe philosophically interesting about what I did, what is maybe art historically interesting about it, and what is, for lack of a better word, sort of practical interest in it. So that's sort of, these remarks just work through a little bit of each of those topics. So to start with philosophy, it seems to me the big worry that haunts philosophy always is that you might just be talking nonsense, right? That the words are flowing on without ever actually managing to mean anything, kind of like sitting in a car and pressing down on the gas pedal like mad, but the gears aren't engaged and you're not going anywhere. Um, um, it would be nice if philosophy had some clear standards for making sense so you could know when you were doing that and when you were failing to do that. Um, but it seems to me, in fact, philosophy doesn't. I'm sure there are a lot of philosophers who would disagree quite strongly with that. But to me, it seems that the philosophy that matters is almost always some kind of reinvention of method, standard, argument. That's why it matters. Um, so that these days, especially, it seems to me philosophy as a sort of professional discipline finds itself in a spot not all that different from the spot contemporary art finds itself in. You can either settle for doing the thing that gets accepted in the philosophy world and not worry about it, or you're just stuck with taking your chances. I worry a lot about making philosophical sense, but I try not to worry about it too much. In the end, it seems to me I've either got an object to show and succeed in showing it, or I don't, and that's about the end of that. Nonetheless, I do hope at least that these lectures have some real philosophical interest, some of it sort of narrow Hegelian, and some of it a bit broader. Um, the claims I made early on about the necessary exposure of Hegelian argument to reading, to me, those are serious claims. And the further claim that art can play a role in that kind of reading, that art and philosophy remain sort of productively entangled in one another, is also something I seriously mean. And I think Hegel offers particularly good ways to think about the entanglement of art and philosophy in one another. It seems to me the general claim about Hegelian argument's internal exposure to reading shapes much of the motive and interest of post-Hegelian continental European philosophy. The key figures here for me are Nietzsche, Bataille, Heidegger, Derrida, and Nancy. Nancy is the only one who made regular appearances in the lectures. Heidegger is probably the one I was most conscious of sort of stripping out of the lectures when I tried to cut them down to size. And that kind of continental Hegel is one particular kind of Hegel. It's fairly strongly at odds with the dominant English and American readings of Hegel these days. And certainly my way of talking about Hegel and art is very different from, say, Pippin's way of talking about Hegel and art. While Hegel was certainly present all the way through these talks, it is, of course, true the talks weren't organized as a continuous reading of Hegel's philosophy, lectures on fine art, nor were they organized by some line of argument that could be laid out across that text. The lectures were organized by the various artists I took up, and in effect, I circled around and repeatedly returned to a pretty limited number of what I take to be key sets of issues about thought, the expressive forms thought can assume, the limits of such expression, and so on. I do sort of hope that these lectures might open into something that would be a more continuous reading of the lectures on fine art. But as it stands, they are not that. I think there's some pretty good reasons now to be interested in Hegel. Many of them have to do with the systematic scope of the lectures on fine art. I mean, Hegel is relatively unique among philosophers in actually looking at a wide range and historical spectrum of art and trying to make sense of it. But the very systematic nature of Hegel's thought is one of the reasons one worries about him. It's the kind of thing that leads philosophers to worry about nonsense, that sort of large scale making sense of everything all at once. You might say, underneath a phrase like the critique of metaphysics, one of the things that's there is we just don't believe in those large systems anymore. We just don't think you can think that way. At the same time, I think the deeper reasons to be interested in Hegel would have to do precisely with the way in which his work actually is the beginning of what gets called the critique of metaphysics. It's already there in him. And that's one of the reasons why the lectures do not turn on what's a pretty standard thing in talking about Hegel, the opposition between totalizing system on the one hand and some kind of existential protest against it on the other. Rather, I take it that whatever that's trying to point to is in fact already at work within Hegel himself. The metaphysics and the critique of metaphysics go side by side. And a phrase I've always liked from Georges Bataille. Bataille says, Hegel is at once the abyss and the papering over the abyss. And that's why Nancy turns out to be such a useful commentator on Hegel for me. I think the stakes in this kind of reading of Hegel are often put in terms of our capacity to find ourselves at home in the world. So that's what Hegel wants for us. Right? People often feel, but it costs us the world if we go Hegel's way with it. But that does seem to me the underlying stake. And coming to be a matter, finding ourselves at home in the world must, on this kind of account, also be a matter of discovering or transforming, or even perhaps being done with that world. So, sometimes when you discover where you're at home, what you discover is that home is intolerable, and you've got to light out for the territories. That seems to me a part of what's at issue. I like these ways of putting the issues because they point towards Hegel's perhaps deepest description of his philosophy, I think the one that's most serious for him, when he says that it all amounts to laying out the system of freedom. Right? Freedom having no sense apart from your inhabitation of some particular world. And I think that in turn opens in very interesting ways that the lectures did not necessarily fully explore into the kind of conversations between Stanley Cavell and Michael Fried that were very much in the texture of art and objecthood. So there's a rich kind of dialogue pursuable there. Another part of Hegel's appeal, another answer to why Hegel, is more directly art historical. The lectures on fine art sit very near the origins of art history as a modern academic discipline. Um, that no doubt is a kind of problem for them. It's a part of why they can seem kind of familiar and dated in many ways. Um, art history, the discipline's attitude towards this bit of its foundation, has varied over time. Wolflin and Riegel, and I would say Warburg as well, with a little bit of hesitation, all had ways of assuming this Hegelian past and reworking it, right, to make their discipline. Erwin Panofsky, and still more explicitly Gombrich, really wanted to get rid of any residues of Hegel in the discipline, right? So I'm in taking up Hegel, I'm interested in sort of renewing that bit of the foundation. This is related to the thought that for me, the recognition of what's generally called theory, right, all that French, more or less philosophical thought that emerges in the 60s and 70s and 80s, doesn't come to art history from the outside the way it does in the case of literary studies. In a certain sense, theory is already working on the same ground that art history emerges on, so that seems to me a particularly rich place for these things to get worked out. And it means that the good of theory in this sense is not primarily a matter of method, but of the constitution of the discipline and its object itself. Panofsky's attempt to get rid of Hegel in art history strikes me as an attempt to substitute epistemological guarantees, how we can know things, for the real difficulties of having an object. And Hegel renews those difficulties in ways that I think are interesting. Cavell, in talking about skepticism, uses the wonderful phrase, taking metaphysical finitude, right? Real difficulties of what is, for an intellectual lack. That's a kind of mistake. It seems to me Panofsky and Gombrich make that kind of mistake. And this, of course, then is also a question about how or where one stands in relation to art history's object. Either, as Panofsky imagines himself to stand, outside it with some point of view that guarantees a kind of objective knowledge of it, or in the midst of its ongoing Hegelian proof, where history is always also criticism. It's the repeated showing or discovery of its object. In that sense, these lectures weren't offering an Hegelian account of post-minimalist art as contrasted with Greenberg and Fried's presumed Kantian account of pre-minimalist modernism. More nearly, the lectures are a kind of attempt to work through the proof of art as it stands at a particular moment. I'll come back to that from a different angle in a minute. But anyway, that's some of why I think this is art historically interesting stuff. The particular object of these lectures was the art of what I've tended to call, particularly towards the end of the lectures, I just kept referring to it as this time. Um, and about that, I'd want to say, first of all, the word this is a demonstrative word. It entails some kind of pointing, this time, not that time. It's individuating. It tacitly distinguishes the time it points to from some other time which might be wholly different from it, or which it might be a repetition of. So it runs over also into the ways in which you might use the word each time, say. As when Nancy writes, that art each time is radically another art, not only another form, another style, but another essence of art. Some of those words are in quotation marks. According to another world, to another political order, but it is at the same time, each time, all that it is, all art as such into itself finally, ... That's how the French goes, that's how the English translation goes. Nancy evidently doesn't know how to find his way out of a reference to Mallarmé, that is what his sentence trails off into. The full line in the Mallarmé poem would speak of all art as into itself eternity finally changes it. That's last bit is what Nancy is dropping as the sentence trails away. The poetry is difficult enough without trying to figure out how it's cropping up through Nancy here. Eternity could point to timelessness. It could point to all of time. I think that Nancy wants to point to neither of those things, but to the endlessness of each time. So each time is a kind of repetition of itself. This time is then not punctual. It's not a simple present, but I think is momentary in exactly Hegel's sense. That is, it's repetitious, it's internally complex, and it is not composed of a simple present. This time, as I use the phrase in the lectures, is perhaps now, this time. It's more certainly some significantly post-minimalist moment. That's where my artists are from. It's also more broadly art's moment of historical explicitness. That is the moment Hegel calls romantic. That's this time. What's not immediately clear, and I think cannot be made clear in the lectures themselves because it's not a matter for the lectures themselves, is whether or not or how far what I've been calling this time might also be called our time. Nancy points out in a wonderful little essay called Finite History that the phrase our time assumes or states a certain reciprocity between its two terms, our and time. And he goes on to say that this is not as if first we exist and then we possess a certain time. That is, as if we here or now were simply to recognize this time as indeed ours, let's say the present. On the contrary, Nancy writes, time gives us by its spacing the possibility of being we, or at least the possibility of saying we and our. This time will be our time for those who find their voice or work within it. And when we find that voice or work, it'll have tense and grammar in it. It'll be complicated. History offers us the past as ourselves, and where we manage to receive that as the future, then you might say that's our time. What about this time? At least as I explored it in the lectures, it seems to me it's a time at difficult odds with itself. It's caught between incessant re-beginning and an ending that doesn't arrive because the middle that would secure the final shape of its plot remains closed to it. It's a thing definitively and always of the past. That's not different from the time of art in general, except in its extremity, the explicitness with which beginning and end run up against one another this time, and so also the difficulty of seeing the line between beginning and end. So another way to think about the lectures is they're a kind of exercise in trying to see that line, in rendering it visible and sensible. And in that sense, the lectures were primarily acts of criticism. In their way, they meant to continue the work of art and objecthood. That'll not necessarily have been fully obvious about them because of the expansive Hegelian apparatus that appears to supplant and kind of overwhelm the implicit Kantian understandings taken to underline and inform Fried's much more direct address to his object. It's probably useful to say that the Kantianism that's usually attributed to Greenberg and to Michael Fried is a pretty tricky thing. I would say in the case of Greenberg, the early appeals to Kant are not serious, and the later writings where he actually tries to struggle with Kant are just befuddled and befuddling. Fried's references to Kant are much less in the foreground, but I think considerably more serious. In neither case can you get out of Kant the idea of medium that they push to the center of their thought. They have a kind of historical account of why medium matters, but that's all it is. Hegel certainly seems useful in bringing out how the term might actually figure for both of them. And it's certainly, I think, a more useful reference than Lessing's Laocoon, which is the other thing Greenberg will refer to. Now, obviously, the kind of criticism I was doing in these lectures is different from the kind of criticism in art and objecthood. And I'll come back to those differences in a second, but I want to sort of underline the ways in which it's not different first. Although Hegel is, in almost all of Hegel's writings, he starts off with an early dismissal of Kant on the topic, whatever the topic is. And then if you pay attention, you see some of Kant's thoughts re-emerging after that dismissal in a surprising way, sometimes very near the center of what Hegel is engaging. And I think that's particularly true of the account of art. When you get to classical sculpture, all of a sudden it is described as beauty at once free and necessary, which is a straight quote from Kant. It's just resurfacing there. So the question of the relation between Kant's criteria and the criteria that ultimately preside over the much more elaborate and complex Hegelian account, it's not clear that there is how different it really is. In any case, I think both on my version of Hegel and in Kant, criticism continues to be an activity that has no deeper ground than your experience of a work and your proofing or testing or whatever of that experience. Criticism then is continuous with a kind of extended description of the work or the experience of the work. There's no moment of judgment to be simply distinguished from that work of description. The description is not evidence for a judgment. The description is, in a strong sense, the judgment. By extended description, I mean both to acknowledge those aspects of, say, Fried's writings that get him called a formalist. Right? He spends a lot of time paying attention to what something looks like, but also to point out that at least on an Hegelian account, description that doesn't engage with content is simply incomplete. Art and objecthood is more or less continuously engaged with the content of minimalist work, and that engagement with its content simply is continuous with its description of what that work is, part of how it unfolds the experience of the work. So there is no separate interpretive engagement with it. On Hegel's account, having a meaning is one way a work's content can be embedded in it. It's essentially the way symbolic art imagines or realizes its content. But it's far from the only shape content can assume, and it's even further from offering a privileged shape for content. Certainly, meaning alone offers no ground for anything like criticism. In fact, one way of glossing Fried's critique of the minimalist object would be to say that it offers nothing but meaning, albeit withheld meaning. And that's a part of his objection to it. In this sense, then, criticism is not an add-on to the work of art. Or as it is, I would say, often nowadays, it's not an aftermarket modification like putting a sunroof on your car. Criticism is the testing and unfolding of the self-criticism that is constituent of the work already, of its participation in a medium that is discovered or invented out of itself, in Stanley Cavell's phrase. If art and objecthood then, from the point of view of these lectures, breaks down anywhere, it's in the summary nature of its judgment. Right? There's a certain failure of patience with what is not yet art. Fried just wants to throw things into outer darkness. And that would certainly be a major part of the difference Hegel's sense of art as having something like beginning and ending makes. There certainly are things that are definitively not art. And I think from the point of view of these lectures, I'd say objects that are thoughtless are not art. And that's funny. I'm going to the Alexander McQueen show next week. I was trying to figure out why I was going. I wasn't entirely sure. And then since I was here, I thought, an Armani suit. It's a nice thing. It's been thought about a lot. It's fitted to its content. It looks good, right? But it is, in the sense I was just using it, thoughtless. That is to say, it has its given, and it addresses the given, and it addresses the given very well. It seems to me that it would be sensible, at least, to say, for Alexander McQueen, the given is there to be transformed. Right? There is a thought there in a different way. The most interesting and difficult failures of art don't fall outside it, they fall within it. That's what makes them interesting and difficult and worth wrestling with, and that's why art and objecthood actually matters. And if he was right and minimalism simply wasn't art, it's because minimalism counts that essay counts so much. Minimalism is, I think, a failure of that kind. It's why Fried reaches out for a term like theatricality in order to condemn it. On my account, that kind of failure reflects the insistence within art of what is not yet art, of its mere incipience. And so in the lectures, it was in general assimilated to the architectural and the symbolic. I think that makes, to me, that makes sense. I think it opens up interesting art historical questions. It goes back into some of the other bits. It also opens up into what I think are some interesting philosophical possibilities. One of these follows from taking what is not yet art, that phrase, as a kind of promise. Right? And you can think about what a promise is, what it takes to make a promise, how a promise is secured or not secured, so on. I think that's an interesting way to think about what it is to speak of something's not yet being art. I think it touches on sort of interesting borderline studio facts, the way in a classroom there is work that is good, there is work that is bad, there is work that is better than some other work, and there is work that maybe it doesn't line up on that axis at all well, but is promising. And you want to know, what is that is promising, right? What am I recognizing about that that's different from what I'm recognizing about, as it were, merely good work or merely better work? The biggest surprise for me in working on this material was that it ended up as it did. That is, from early on, I'd always known that I wanted to end up talking about Peter Eisenman's architecture, and I always knew I wanted to be able to talk particularly about the Wexner Center. Early on, I tried to do it simply by talking about the architecture. I mean, it seemed to me that, when I talked about Eva Hess, I talked about her work. When I talked about Smithson, I talked about her work. With Eisenman, what else was I going to talk about except the architecture? And Michael and Holly pointed out when I first tried to do that I really wasn't going to get anywhere doing that I wasn't going to be able to talk about the Wexner unless I could talk about it as a place for exhibitions and about particular exhibitions in it. And I knew she was right about that. But I couldn't sort of get anywhere with it until I saw the Lawler show in it, right? And it's, as if other shows could be well curated in it, but that didn't necessarily mean they had the capacity to address the architecture in a way that told you something about the architecture. And then when I did realize that, finally, I sort of realized that I had thought when I started with Daniel Buren that I was going to take up an artist who was normally taken to have certain kinds of institutional interests, and by addressing that stuff then, I was not going to have to address it again later. So that Lawler showed up as the place where all this came back was not only a surprise, but it led me to think about the scope of the project as a whole again. And of course, the question of the institution of art was not a preliminary obstacle to be gotten past. It turned out to be, in a sense, what the whole project actually was about. And I'm still sort of absorbing that because it's the last thing I came to was that recognition. Most of the time nowadays, it seems to me when we hear someone talking about institutions of art, what we do here is something that has to do with what's come to be called institutional critique, that more or less in some general way sort of bears on our sense of tainted containers of dubious goods. Right? That there's something in that situation that is not right. And I suppose what I've wanted out of the word institution is very much what I wanted when I was talking about compart and compartment in Hess. That is, to hear the verb institute inside the thing institution again, and take up the question of institutions with that hearing in mind. So that if we think about the museum as institution, we're imagining it as something that has some definite, kind of palpable relation to the instituting of art, whatever we might mean by that verb. For example, to quote Helen Molesworth, serving as an extended public atelier for artists, right? That's the museum's role as an institutor of art, or a possible role for the museum. That's, of course, a kind of old way of thinking what the museum was, and it's a little bit hard to hear that sense now when we think about museums and we hear patrons, we hear collectors, we hear expanded audiences, we hear all of that. We sort of have to, so what is the museum for? Is it finally for something like an extended public atelier for artists? Is it a moment in the instituting of art? What would it be like to try and make that hearing of the museum active in it again? And of course, the other place where you might ask about the instituting of art in this sense, or an other place, is of course the art schools. So having started with philosophy and tried to say something about art history and a little something about criticism, I want to end by trying to say a little something about the art school, which is, after all, where we are. And of course, saying things about art school in an art school is, and when you are not an art teacher, is always tricky. I'll say a couple of things. Arthur Danto once remarked, and I don't think he ever published this remark, but he said that now, after, as he sees it, after the end of art history, it was enough to be admitted to art school to be an artist. Right? There is nothing beyond some sort of indefinite body of techniques one needs to be or even can be taught. Right? You've gotten your ratification by being admitted to art school. So there's nothing you can be taught in the ways art schools once could plausibly claim to teach you art, to make you an artist. And presumably by the same token, there's nothing much you can fail at. Right? You're there already. My own experience of art schools in the 90s, when I was doing a certain amount of traveling around, doing studio visits and things, suggested that Danto was actually pretty much right about all of that. Schools at the end of the century looked a lot like what used to be called finishing schools. That is, places where you were given the right social skills, the right words to use, lines of talk that you could use for visitors to your studio. Often these were theoretical lines of talk. Conversations could unroll, exchanges could go on quite happily, and you never had to stumble over sort of embarrassing questions like, what is that? What exactly am I looking at? With luck, you could get through a whole studio visit without having to look at anything. And if you did wind up looking at something, more often than not, conversation would suddenly have this magic new verb to reference in it. And the statement that that thing we were looking at referenced this, that, or the other thing was really enough to take care of that bit of business. Referenced Goya or Deleuze or minimalism or something. That's no doubt a rather harsh characterization of the situation, but I think the underlying quandary really is there. An art school that takes its possibility, its sense from the possibility, the ongoing possibility of the classical, and that's what art school, I think, overwhelmingly has been for most of its history. Such a school was clear about what its job was, what its standards were, how it might matter sometimes to break with those standards. It knew what was central and what was peripheral and how things hung together. That knowledge hasn't actually gone away. You can still presumably teach that way. I imagine many people still do. But it no longer seems to have any hold on the actual circumstance. It may be good to be able to draw, but no one now thinks you become an artist by learning how to draw. It's because you're an artist that drawing may be useful to you at some point. This time, as the lectures explored it, shows a beginning in art that is at once different from its ending and kind of inseparable from it, so that it appears not as something that can be simply overcome and moved on from, but as something in kind of continual need of acknowledgement or working through a kind of obstacle that is always going to be there. You may indeed already be an artist in entering art school, but an education in art then presumably has that as its problem. It must find some way to put an end to beginning and not simply continue it. And I suppose that's one way to think about the red line that ended up cutting across this diagram. Right? There's no smooth passage across that line. That's what it means that the classical is no longer a possibility. There's no theoretical high road that lifts you over it or around it. What you have to do is find some way to stop beginning and start ending, which is presumably a kind of version of the stories about repudiation and breakthrough that have always been part of modernist art's account of itself. Pollock or Caro, all these people who were doing something and then did something else, or in philosophy, for that matter, Wittgenstein and Heidegger, who did something and then did something else, and had to find their way through across something where no mediation was possible. Nothing was going to carry you across. Such stoppings and startings that are turns within and against your practice, right? That is the stuff of self-criticism. Like the opening and closing of the mouth, they're the punctuation without which we would be voiceless and senseless. One way to put the problem of an education in art would be to say that it has to unfold without criteria, can be tested or proved or assessed only against criteria that are only ever given, if at all, in the outcome. But that is precisely what it means to institute something. If there is any kind of single thread that runs through these different marks I've tried to make about philosophy and art history and criticism and art education, it's maybe well put by Cavell in his essay Music Discomposed, where he says the stake of the modern artist, as of the modern person more generally, is to find something to be sincere and serious in, something he can mean, and he may not at all. That is, I think, the real hardness of the modern, of life and work unsponsored by anything deeper than our actual lives and practices, so also justified by nothing less than whatever depth we can make or find in those lives and practices. It seems to me Hegel offers words and forms in which to think about these things, and those words and forms may lead to standing differently within your practice or your life. But he can't do anything to deliver you from the demand itself. The demand is sort of permanent. Nothing is sponsored. If Hegel helps in making out the sort of dangers and prospects that make one thing a chance and another thing not a chance, that's all to the good. But in the end, you're still stuck with just taking your chances. And I guess that's where I'll stop. I hope that's useful as a way of starting a discussion. I hope we can talk about whatever. And thank you for your months of patience.
Can I just say,
No.
could I just say, can you use this? Because we are recorded, and if you don't use it, we can't pick it up. Actually, you can pick it up like this. We'd like to record it, otherwise we're not going to get the whole discussion. It's all going through the mics onto record. Does anyone want to?
Yes, maybe.
Hi, I wanted to take you up on your statement that criticism is just description, which I kind of like. But description is a very baggy term and can go from, scientific to kind of emoting. So, can you elaborate that idea a bit more?
I can try. I guess the first thing that I'd want to say is the ways I talked about the people I talked about were supposed to be instances of description. So obviously, it's not a scientific kind of description. How far you want to call the kind of description I was doing formal seems to me probably you may have different feelings about. it's a matter of saying what the work is, right? Bearing in mind that what you were describing is a work. I'm teaching art history. I would sometimes ask students, I would put up a slide and ask students to write a description. And of course, there are all sorts of choices there that students would not see. Am I describing a slide? Am I describing what the slide is of? Am I describing what's in the thing the slide is of, like the people, right? Where do you cut it? And you might say the description itself has to show itself as a description of a work, right? Work is not given, it's what's at issue. That's where it gets very tricky. I also think it's pretty clear from my general kind of allegiance to Freud's kind of criticism, and again from the things I did in the lectures, that I take it there is such a thing as the experience of the work, right? And that a description of the work is an unfolding of the experience of the work. And I'm going to hang on as long as I can to the ambiguity of that of. That is, whether the experience is sort of the works or mine of it. Because the wager is something like a good description of the work will not have to make that decision. It will end up showing you the experience of the work as what it is in its unfolding, something like that. Is that enough answer? I mean, I think.
Yeah, beyond sort of pointing to what one takes to be good examples of doing that, it's very hard to say what that would be,
Yeah, because the standards in some sense for its being a description are the same as the standards for its being a work and being the work that it is. So you can't have a general practice of description, although you can have a general sort of aspiration for it. And it's probably also true that I'm using the word description in part because so much criticism, and now I'm not talking about fancy criticism, but say, what you read in the back of an art magazine, so on, will give you an interpretation of the work and an account of what it looks like without any particular effort to get those two things together. And often it looks like the interpretation is what is giving rise to the final opinion about the work. So I'm using description pretty polemically to push interpretation off of the stage as far as I can. So that.
I think this might follow on from that question in a useful way, which is a question I have in a contradiction that I feel in reading Art and Objects, of not having a close read in the you have of it. And that's between the criticism of Tony Smith not being able to adequately describe his journey of his travel over the New Jersey Turnpike, and so therefore which I read as an inability to mediate that experience as words.
So say the last part.
An inability to mediate that experience as words seems to be, or maybe is Freud's criticism of Smith in that situation. And then the end of the essay with Presence is Grace, which seems to imply an unmediated situation. And the contradiction, it strikes me as a contradiction in there that I wonder how you, how that would be unfolded reading.
Let's see if I can answer that in a couple of parts. One, I think, I may come back to this one or not, so I want to get it out of the way first. It's very interesting to read, on the one hand, Art and Objecthood and its relation to Tony Smith. On the other hand, Robert Smithson's attack on Freud, which also turns through an account of Tony Smith. And they have a very interesting relation to one another, and particularly around the question you're starting from, the sort of negative bit about
Smith's inability to expound his work suitably. So maybe I'll come back to that, maybe not. I don't think the two, as you're putting it, are in fact in contradiction, because I don't think they're after the same thing. It's a peculiarity of Art Nugent as a piece of writing that Fried is, on the one hand, giving a great deal of first-person stuff. This is what it is like to encounter this work, this is how it makes me feel, kind of stuff. And on the other hand, he is quoting a great deal from the artists who made that work, and most notably Tony Smith in this one extended passage. And in general, he is not using their words against them. That is, in general, he takes it that they are good describers of their work. He's not disagreeing with their accounts of the work. And I think that applies as well to the description of Tony Smith, who in many ways comes in for the most direct sort of criticism of some kind. But I think he feels that what Tony Smith says about this highway drive he takes, for those of you who don't know the essay, he goes out and drives along an unfinished elevated throughway and sort of says this experience is kind of the key to my art. Say that's the gist of it. And Fried agrees with him, which is interesting. Clearly, in all these cases, he thinks the artists are good describers of their work, and what their descriptions show you is that it is not work. It's not accomplished work, it's not achieved work, it's not art, it's not what's good. And the artists themselves say that. They obviously don't hear themselves saying that. So he's asking you to hear them a little differently. So it's not that Smith is failing to describe something. He is exactly describing it. And that's the problem, that Smith doesn't hear that is an account of where the work comes from. It comes from a certain deafness to one's own experience. And that work is the kind of monumentalization of that deafness. It's a place then where the experience of the work and the experience of the work, in a certain sense, fall apart or fall together in an unhappy way. So that's what I want to say about the first part of that. Presentness is grace. I have a little bit less to say about it. It's not my favorite sentence in the essay by a good bit. It is obviously meant, and this is where it does seem to not be a contradiction, but clearly means to mean in opposition to the minimalist emphasis on presence. As if somehow there are two ways of occupying time possible for a work of art. Minimalism chooses the wrong way, Caro chooses the right way. I think even if in general you're persuaded that Fried is right to see a difference there, and that his characterization of that difference makes a certain amount of sense, you're probably going to end up worrying about it. You're probably going to end up being unhappy about the opposition between good presentness and bad presence. And you're going to want to think about that more. And of course, that's something I think I get out of Hegel, is a sense of the momentary as structured and complex and not involving plain presentness in his presence, but involving a thought of time that Fried and Art Nugent simply doesn't have, but is trying to have. Is that?
Yeah, so there's a fine cutting between presentness and presence.
Too fine, I think, for almost anybody. Right? That's one of the, I think there are two places where you can be, as it were, utterly persuaded by the whole essay, in some sense. You're still not going to be happy with that opposition. And you're still not going to be happy with the idea that minimalism should be relegated to outer darkness and never darken or restore again. Something wrong about that. I think Hegel gives you better ways of thinking both about the time of art and about the kind of failure that actually matters to art. And Mill is clearly, if it is a failure, it's a failure that matters to art. It's not a failure external to it.
Anyone else? Could you talk about a bit more about the, I suppose, call it Kantian moment, in relationship to
The what?
the Kantian moment, Kant,
Oh, yeah.
with Greenberg and with Freud, better formed with Freud than you're saying, there's one in the background, quite messed up with Greenberg.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that. And Greenberg, early on in his sort of general statements about what he thinks he's up to as a critic, makes a certain appeal to Kant. And he says, Kant teaches us for the first time about criticism that doesn't come from the outside, but is internal to a practice. And he's going to use that to think about the role of self-criticism in modern art. Modern art is defined by its capacity for self-criticism. Within a couple of pages of saying that, he seems to have already lost his ability to hang on to the difference between self-criticism and criticism from the outside. Right? So it's not something he's got a firm grip on. It's also something he's getting from Kant in general, and particularly he's appealing to the introduction to the first critique, which has nothing to do with art, beauty, or anything, but has to do with the fate of reason and reason's need to criticize itself. So it's an interesting appeal to Kant. It makes a certain amount of sense. It doesn't get very deep into Greenberg's actual thought about art. Late in life, in the late 70s and 80s, when people are starting to talk about postmodernism, Greenberg goes back and really looks at Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, the text on art and beauty, and gets himself tied up in the most god-awful knots about sort of the experience of beauty is an experience that you're aware of as an experience, but it's not like Duchamp being aware of the experience, because Duchamp is the devil, it's different, and he just can't get out of it. And those two things are Greenberg's dealings with Kant. And I think they're both just really unsatisfactory. On the other hand, they do get you to go read the Kant and think about it. Freud has spent a lot more time sort of worrying about the third critique and being worried at it in tandem with Stanley Cavell, who is deeply interested in it. Shows up in Art and Objecthood only in a single footnote that says, as Stanley Cavell remarked in a seminar on the critique of judgment, works of art are in this respect a lot like people. And there has been a kind of running analogy with persons and works of art in Art and Objecthood. That's a very interesting remark, and it comes from the heart of Kant's attempts to think about art. And I think it's a thought always worth pushing and pulling at. But however good and deep and interesting that reference is, if you want to know what medium means for Freud, Kant's not going to give you any help there, and that remark's not going to give you any help there. So, but hang on, Joe wanted to jump in.
Can I just do a criticism? The other thing I was wanting to ask.
Well, Joe wanted right in the middle of my remarks about Greenberg and Kant, so I want to.
It's not appropriate. It's
Oh, okay.
difference to let me finish.
The sense there's something about Greenberg and Kant, I don't know about Freud really, but it's got something to do with media. It's something to do with potentially a kind of idea of practice, say like painting. It's all figured around painting Greenberg and it's Smith's or Serre's problems with minimalism. There's almost there's a relationship to Krauss and expanded field in some respects. This aspect of like what happens between things.
Yeah.
But I thought the question is, I think it's more in the sense to do the question more in the 70s. Was Hegel present as a kind of force in terms of like the way you were using the Schinkel museum plans, the way of it kind of mapped the Hegelian system out. I think you said something about something that you could traverse some of these positions. Things weren't needed put into painting or sculpture.
Let me say a couple of things in response to what you've said already, just very quickly, if I can get them in the right order here. One thing it seems to me right to say is, although Greenberg's making these noises about Kant, when you look at the beginning, and when he talks about medium, he points to Lessing, which is a very straightforward theory of medium. You know, flat things can do the things flat things can do, things that take time do the things it takes time to do. When you look at Greenberg's actual early remarks on medium, they're rather more interesting than either of those two things. You know, and he sort of says, on the one hand, there's the kind of story you can tell about subject matter and the trouble subject matter gets itself into. And he said, and there's also a story you can tell about the arts because there is, he says, such a thing as a system of the arts. And there he's very interested in the way in which music makes itself pure and therefore stands as a kind of model to other arts that then aspire to the sort of purity music seems to. And there you get the idea that there might be a connection between what a medium is and the fact of a system of mediums. And that within that there might be sensible ways to think about betweens that belong to the system and therefore are a place where mediums actually meet in some addressable way. That's I think, what you can get out of Hegel. As far as sort of the late 60s, early 70s art world, as far as I know, Hegel was no particular presence at all. But clearly the question about medium and being between mediums was very much there. It's even there in Fried's use of the term theatricality, which is a between the arts term, and he addresses it as such. So you get people making attempts at sorting that out. Krauss's Sculpture in the Expanded Field is clearly a kind of pivotal essay for almost any attempt to think about medium and mediums, because it says sculpture is what happens at the conjunction of architecture and landscape, or not architecture and not landscape, and so on. There are all sorts of reasons why it's not a very good thought. It's not one you continue with very well, but it does bring into this question again the relationship between a medium and there being mediums in general. It does so in an interesting way. It does so in ways that can be easily retranslated into terms of Hegelian dialectic. So it becomes a place where I think start thinking, oh, there's a way through this. You can start thinking your way through it. But of course, she's not thinking of Hegel at all. She's thinking nothing but semiotics. Is that?
I think I have a good last question to this series, which is, so you've given us a series of talks, which are, we can think of as chapters to a book, and you've given us a conclusion as well today, or an afterword. And I'm quite interested to have you tell us a little bit about, give us a preface writing about philosophy and art, so a little bit about the beginnings of this project. I'm kind of curious about that.
It began a long time ago. It's I'm really not sure what's a good answer to that, except I think in terms of satisfactions, which I'm not sure I have with this yet, but the promise of satisfaction for me is that I have, as it were, always done philosophy, and I have never been institutionally, either as a student or as a faculty member, a philosopher, and have never wanted to be. Because it seems to me philosophy has a way of sort of systematically eradicating, I'm hesitating between saying its objects or the interest that leads you to it in the first place. So, philosophers, particularly of art, almost never address works of art. And when they do, they say horrible things, stupid things. Right? That has always led me to think I want to do philosophy somewhere where the objects get to stay and the philosophy goes away, if anything goes away. And on the other hand, it strikes me that art history has its own ways of not taking its objects seriously in the name of the object, right? So finding a good way to do philosophy in which the objects actually continue to play an active role is something I have always wanted, I've always been trying to do. And this is as close as I've managed to come. An interesting example of the philosophical difficulty I have, which maybe is worth saying, is the much vexed one. People who do philosophy of art, if they do, and as a rule they don't do modernist art, but if they do, what they want to do is Duchamp. And the reason they want to do Duchamp is they want to explain why Duchamp either is or is not art. They want to settle the Duchamp case. And they cannot let Duchamp be difficult. Let's say. So the Duchamp always goes away, and what shows up instead is the art world, or a theory of beauty, or something. But you're left at the end with Duchamp gone. And it seems to be a nice, clear case of why I don't want to be a philosopher, but do want to do whatever it is I'm trying to do with these lectures. Is that And it does seem to be another one of those places where the forms of our professional life are increasingly at odds with the presumed stakes and interests that motivate that life.
Steve, could you talk a bit more about Nancy in relationship to these subjects? Because he's obviously there. I'm wondering, at what point were you reading Hegel through, in relationship to Nancy? And, obviously it has something to do with, does it have anything to do with the French constellation? Or completely something else?
Yeah, I think that there are two angles into that, and I'll try and say something about both of them. The first one is my first book on Derrida. I was arguing that Derrida was in some important sense a modernist philosopher. Right? And to make out what I meant by modernist, I used Cavell and Fried as a kind of introduction to that term than to get to Derrida. It seems to me now, when I did that, I had sort of already assigned myself the job someday of trying to turn that around. And I've sort of done that now. And in those terms, I think Derrida mattered to me, continues to matter to me, for all sorts of reasons. But I came to him very, very strongly from Heidegger, somewhat less strongly from Hegel. And that made, and I was mostly interested, I was interested in literary texts at the time. As I started working more and more in art and art history, Derrida didn't become less interesting, but he became less pointed for me. Nancy knows his way around visual arts, he cares about them, it shows in the way he writes. And after a career where he moved around a lot of different directions, he started producing some really terrific writing on Hegel. So all of a sudden, he became the person I could take up in this way. So that's one kind of answer. The other kind of answer, which is also a different way, back to Joe's question, clearly it was important. I was worrying about Freed and all this stuff, and mostly looking at the artists I talked about here and worrying about the history they came out of. But in the 90s, I got very interested for a variety of reasons in French painting. And that reshaped, or taught me new questions, reshaped some things in some ways. Nancy figures in that in a certain way. So also does, I think, the finally getting away from Kant and resituating the question closer to Hegel. I think that partly came out of the engagement with French painting, which is, I think, also part of what you were asking about, too. It's harder to pin down how exactly that happened, but you might say, when the group of us started working on as painting, I was still spending a lot of time worrying about Kant, and by the time we got out of as painting, I wasn't. So this project followed pretty quickly on that one.
Was that anything to do with work around Mozart?
Yeah, I mean, it had everything to do, in some way, with, I'm not going to say tableau, right, but it had everything to do with working with Antai, working with, and it's also why Buren kicks this off in some funny way. I mean, he's the odd one out in that group in some ways, but in other ways, there are very good reasons why he ended up being in here. How much of that, how you divide what is, as it were, merely autobiographical from the serious threat, I'm not quite sure, but that's certainly how it happened.
Was it also with one of those artists that you were looking at in France, many of them read a lot of this stuff, they actually were up to speed with
yes, although they weren't, it would come down to different cases in different ways. I mean, certainly one of the things I very much think is true about French intellectual history in the 20th century is, after being pretty closed up early in the century, French philosophy all of a sudden discovered German philosophy. So right through the 30s, but beginning in the late 20s on, you have this massive sort of taking up of Hegel, of Heidegger, and of Husserl by French intellectuals. And almost anybody who comes of age as an ambitious French philosopher or philosopher-like person does as their first writing either a commentary on one of those three figures or a translation of one of those figures or both. That just seems to be sort of deep facts of 20th century intellectual life in France. Artists emerging during that time are more or less exposed to that. And the more or less matters a good bit. But some of them certainly are in that current or sort of swimming against it. So Antai is someone who I think is very much kind of in the theologically inflected end of that current. Christian Bonfoy is someone who is in some ways swimming against the tide. I mean, he's like Deleuze, right? Everybody else is going to talk Hegel, he's going to talk Bergson. But he knows the waters. So yeah, it's a rich place for somebody caught in my quandaries at the time. I don't know how else to put it.